So we're continuing with daily uploads this week to celebrate the fact 1,000 of you actually know who I am and care enough to stick around. And I thought today I'd talk about Avatar briefly because I've been slowly watching it through at the moment, one episode a day while I cook and eat my lunch. And I recently watched episode 5 of series 3 called The Beach. I think it might be my favourite episode so far. Don't hold me to that because I haven't taken any time to think back, but it's a really good episode despite the fact it's also a really strange episode. Let me explain the plot first. Aang and the gang take a backseat as the subplot, where the main story centres around the antagonists, Azula, Mai, Ty Lee and Zuko. They're forced to spend a weekend on holiday at Ember Island because Ozai wants them out of the way for a bit, basically, but anyway, while they're there they play volleyball, go to a party, and have an argument on the beach that ends up shedding light on their backstories. The idea is kind of summed up by these two weird nans.
The beach has a special way of smoothing even the most ragged edges. Ember Island reveals the true you.
So that's what happens. The beach washes away their ragged edges and reveals the people beneath. You'd think an episode like this would really kill the pace of the show and be like a filler episode, but it's not. Partly because of the brilliant humour in it.
That's a sharp outfit, Chan. Careful, you could puncture the hull of an Empire-class Fire Nation battleship, leaving thousands to drown at sea. Because it's so sharp.
But also because of the emotional payoff at the end, when, during this argument on the beach, Zuko vents about feeling angry and not knowing why.
Everything should be perfect, right? I should be happy now. But I'm not. I'm angrier than ever and I don't know why.
And then, when pushed and put under pressure, he explodes.
Answer the question. Come on, answer it.
I'm angry at myself! Because I'm confused. Because I'm not sure I know the difference between right and wrong anymore.
Which, by the way, is not only emotional payoff for the episode itself, but in the wider scope of the overall show, it's Zuko's real turning point. It's kind of here where he properly realises exactly what Iroh tried to tell him at the end of Series 2.
And now you have come to the crossroads of your destiny. It's time for you to choose. It's time for you to choose good.
Anyway, there's two interesting things I wanted to touch on specifically. The first is that this episode is a good example for a particular trait of the show's overall style, which is to undermine cliches. Not necessarily parody them, maybe sometimes, but definitely undermine, because there's a lot of moments in this show that get dangerously close to something cliche, only for the show to then sabotage that moment with something unexpected or ridiculous happening.
I need to ask you something.
What?
Please, come closer.
What is it?
Will you go penguin sledding with me?
Zhao the Conqueror. Zhao the Moon Slayer. Zhao the Invincible! Get it off! And you know about our tribe's existence. We have no choice but to imprison you here forever. Just kidding. But seriously, don't tell anyone.
Those weren't the most subtle examples. I picked more obvious ones because it's easier to convey the point that way, but it's often a good way for writers to kind of stop the story becoming too formulaic, because every writer has moments of cliche at points. I mean, there's thousands of stories out there. There's naturally going to be typical sorts of things that crop up a lot, no matter how much you try to avoid them or how original you try to be. But if you've got the awareness to see when your story is doing something a bit cliche, you can then undermine the situation a little bit to keep it feeling more natural, really. Undermining it kind of peels back a bit of the drama and makes the cliche a little less over the top and a little more human, let's say. And this episode itself is a giant cliche. Not only have you got the bunch of melodramatic teenagers discovering themselves on a beach, but you've also got a high school style house party. Having that as the plot out of nowhere in an epic fantasy show would normally make you roll your eyes, but it works because the cliche is constantly undermined by the strange, ridiculous things that can come out of putting a scary, power-mad villain and her assistants in an ordinary social setting. The cliche becomes a bizarre comedy because the characters are so at odds with it. I mean, Azula is a kind of insane, intimidating fire princess that makes sense for a war leader who hunts down the Avatar and everything else, but so many jokes from this episode stem from putting her in situations where that insanity is out of place. They play volleyball, but Azula's obsessed with crushing her opponents into the dirt, and we get this.
Keep serving the ball to her left and we'll destroy her and the rest of her team. Dismissed.
And then when she wins.
We've defeated you for all time. You will never rise from the ashes of your shame and humiliation. That was was fun.
You've got Mei and Zuko having a slightly emo lovers tiff. You've got Tylee attracting all the attention to the point she can't bear it and uses her paralysing grip on everyone. And then Azula being jealous of that attention and taking Tylee's advice to try and laugh at everything blokes say in order to attract them.
It's a great place, if you like sand.
Which all leads to this happening.
You're pretty.
Together, you and I will be the strongest couple in the entire world. We will dominate the Earth!
The 2 points I'm making boil down to this. One, whilst cliches can be terrible run-of-the-mill moments that cause an audience to roll their eyes and lose interest, they can also be something fun to play around with if you know what you're doing. Good humour can come out of taking a cliche as though it were a lump of clay and just messing about with it, such as this entire episode basically does. The second thing is that ridiculing a show's villains is an underutilised way to help the audience empathise with them. I mean, in bad shows, villains are all scary and outright evil, and it's never explained why, they're just evil. In good shows, the villains are evil, but you can understand them enough to see why they think the way they do, and you half agree with them in some sense and can empathise with them. And normally the writers help you to empathise with them by showing the villain's tragic, sad past, or by giving them a speech to explain their philosophy in a way that half convinces you. But it's very rare they make a mockery of their big scary villains as a way to help you empathise, like they do here. I mean, imagine if there'd been a bit in Harry Potter where the audiences get to laugh at Voldemort for not having a nose, or for obsessively killing his own followers or something. It's difficult to kind of pull that off without it ruining the story, but this is the first moment in Avatar where we really get to connect with Azula as a character, see her human side, and it all comes about specifically from ridiculing her in comedy. We recognise she's not just an infinitely scary, terrifying person, but she's kind of ridiculous and dysfunctional at the same time. And it makes me think of Jojo Rabbit and how it highlights Hitler and the Nazis weren't just horrific people, but also kind of ridiculous, jumped up Boy Scout group built on a romanticised view of the heroes in children's books at the time. Like, I'm pretty sure most of the terrifying people in human history were actually kind of ridiculous, dysfunctional, insecure idiots at the same time. I mean, this insecurity and paranoia is part of the reason they're so desperate to be feared in the first place, and it's when you recognise their insecurity that you kind of take away their power. This episode does all of that with Azula by ridiculing her. She becomes less this all-powerful monster figure now and more this messed up human. So in that sense, this episode is a high school comedy in the middle of an epic fantasy show that ridicules all its villains while also providing character development with a genuinely touching emotional conclusion that serves as a turning point for the show's original antagonists. Getting all that to work at once in one episode is incredibly impressive. Do I think the episode's perfect? No, I think sending them off to the island in the first place was a bit contrived. I also think the emotional argument at the end could have done with a bit more time to make some of the lines subtler, but with only 24 minutes of runtime to work with, that's expected. It's still a great episode from a great show, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. That's all I have to say today. Thanks for watching this video. Thanks for having 1,000 of you. If you like it, like it. If you haven't subscribed and you want to, subscribe, and hopefully see you tomorrow.